Page 157. Activity 2. Previewing vocabulary. Nouns. Category. Dialect. Majority. Sample. Standard. Adjectives. Identical. Noticeable. Unique. Adverbs. While. Whereas. Page 158. Activity 3. Classifying lecture organization. 1.
Personal computers have revolutionized the way people work and communicate. I could talk for hours about the wide use of personal computers, but today we only have time to introduce 3 major uses of computers: at home, in business, and in education.
2.
In today's lecture, I will provide the most recent information concerning the growth and characteristics of the U.S. population.
3.
You may have guessed by now that my topic for today's lecture is differences between American and British English. In particular, I want to examine 3 categories of difference. First and most obvious is pronunciation. Second, vocabulary. And third, grammar.
Page 159. Activity 4. Taking notes. Part 1.
Good afternoon. To introduce my topic today, I'd like you to listen to 2 speech samples and tell me where the speakers are from. Ready? Okay, here's the first one.
Today's weather forecast calls for partly cloudy skies in the morning, clearing by mid-afternoon with winds up to 15 miles an hour out of the west. The high temperature will be 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and the low will be 64.
Okay, now, where do you think that speaker was from?
America.
The United States.
Canada.
Yes, most of you got it. That was what we call a standard American accent, which means the accent that is spoken by the majority of people who live in the United States and Canada. Now, listen to a different speaker reading the same text.
Today's weather forecast calls for partly cloudy skies in the morning, clearing by mid-afternoon with winds up to 15 miles an hour out of the west. The high temperature will be 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and the low will be 64.
And where is that speaker from?
England.
United Kingdom.
Great Britain.
Yes, of course, that was British English. So you may have guessed by now that my topic for today's lecture is differences between standard American and British English. In particular, I want to examine 3 categories of difference. First and most obvious is pronunciation. Second, vocabulary. And third, grammar. So, to begin, let's go back to the subject of accent, or pronunciation. You had no trouble identifying the North American and British accents because each of them has a unique sound. What is it? Well, one obvious difference is in the pronunciation of the letter A. For example, most Americans say can't, but the British say can't. Or Americans say bath, and the British say bath. The A sound is very common in American English, but not very common in British English. Another noticeable difference between American and British pronunciation is the R sound. In British English, the R sound is very often dropped. It disappears. To give some examples, Americans say car, but the British say car. Americans say first, but British say first. A big American city is New York for Americans, but New York to the British. Speech samples you heard at the beginning of this lecture, the American speaker said forecast, but the British said forecast. In that single word, you can hear the difference, both in the A vowel and in the pronunciation of R. Listen again. Forecast, forecast. A third difference is the pronunciation of the T sound in the middle of words. In British English, it is normally pronounced, but in American English, it changes to a D or disappears. For example, a British person will say little, but an American says little. You can hear this difference particularly with numbers. Brits say 21, 22, and so on. But Americans drop the T and say 21, 22, and so on. So there you have just 3 of the differences that give American and British pronunciation their unique sounds. There are many more, but now let's go on to talk about vocabulary.
Page 160. Activity 6. Taking Notes. Part 2.
Some people believe that American English vocabulary and British English vocabulary are very different, but actually they are not. The English language has more than 1 million words, yet there are only a few hundred words and expressions that are different in American and British English. You can see a few of them in the chart right here. So, for instance, Americans say truck, but the Brits say lorry. Another well-known example is elevator, which is used in the United States, and lift, which is the British term. Now, although the number of vocabulary differences is small, funny misunderstandings can sometimes occur. For instance, if an American says, "I'm going to wash up," he would go into the bathroom and wash his hands and face. But a British person may be quite surprised to see him go to the bathroom because in England, to wash up means to wash the dishes. Vocabulary differences can also create some confusing situations in restaurants. If an Englishman traveling in the United States enters a restaurant and orders bangers and mash, the American waiter would be totally confused. He wouldn't know that the man wanted sausage and mashed potatoes. Finally, let's talk a bit about grammar. I've left this category for last because in the area of grammar, standard American and British English are nearly identical. One common difference, however, involves the past participle of the verb get. For example, an American might ask, "Have you gotten your grade yet?" Whereas a Brit would ask, "Have you got your grade yet?" Another difference is in the use of the verb have, especially in questions. Americans say, "Do you have any ideas?" But the British say, "Have you any ideas?" There are also differences in prepositions. So, for instance, in the United States, it's correct to say that John is different from Mary. But the British will say that John is different than Mary. But these differences are very small and few in number. And this brings me to my conclusion, which is this. Standard British and Standard American English are so similar that most speakers of these two types will have no trouble understanding one another. American and British English are not two different languages. Rather, they are two dialects, two varieties of the same language, English.
Page 163. Focus on testing. Using context clues. Conversation 1.
Have you ever heard of Esperanto?
Huh?
Esperanto. It's a language.
Really? I've never heard of it. Where is it spoken?
Lots of places. According to this article, it's actually an artificial language. It was invented in 1887 by a man from Poland.
That's interesting. So who speaks this language now?
Well, it says here that there may be as many as 15 million people who speak Esperanto as a second language.
What does Esperanto mean, anyway? It doesn't sound like Polish.
It's not. The vocabulary of Esperanto comes from lots of different languages. Esperanto means hope in Latin.
Well, I hope I never have to learn it. It's hard enough trying to learn English.
Question 1. What is Esperanto? Question 2. Where did the woman get her information about Esperanto? Question 3. Which of the following is probably true about Esperanto?